In this video, you are going to learn how to write fractions as decimals. So if you have 2/4 or 3/10 or 15/100, you are going to learn how to write that as a decimal. Let's start with the fraction 3/10. Alright, I have 3/10. Now the first thing I should do is think about what would this look like on a place value chart. Well, here's my place value chart, and you can see I have my ones place value, my decimal, tenths, and hundredths, THS at the end. So 3/10 would be like this. I would have 3 in the tenths. So how would I write that as a decimal? Well, I have 0 ones, decimal, 3 in the tenths. So that's how I would write 3/10 as a decimal. Let's try another one. Let's say that I have 6/10. How would I write that as a decimal? Well, 6/10, I'd put a 6 in the tenths place value. And as a decimal, I would have 0 ones, decimal, 6. 0.6 shows 6/10. What if I had this? 15/100. Well, looking at my place value chart, 15/100, I can't put 15 like that. I can't do that because only one number goes in each place value. So 15/100, I would have my 5 there and my 1 there. So to write that as a decimal, I have 0 ones and, or decimal, 1 5. So 15/100 is written as decimal 0.15. Here's another example. What if I have 72/100? How would I write that as a decimal? Well, I have 0 ones and 72/100. Notice that the 2 is in the hundredths place value. So I would write that as 0.72. This is my tenths place value. This is my hundredths. So because I'm talking about hundredths, I should have up to my hundredths being shown in my decimal. This might be a tricky one. What if you have 7/100? Well, on my place value chart, I have 7/100, so I put a 7 in the hundredths. And that means that I have 0/10 and 0 ones. So I would write it as 0.07. Because I have 7/100, my 7 is in the hundredths place value. Here's a tricky one. What if I said, show me 2/5 as a decimal? Well, that's tough because our place value has only tenths and hundredths. We don't have fifths. So how are we going to put that in? Well, what you have to do is you have to think of an equivalent fraction for 2/5 that has either tenths or hundredths in the denominator. So how could I get a 10 in the denominator as an equivalent fraction? Well, 5 times 2 is 10, so then I should multiply the numerator by 2. What's 2 times 2? That's 4. So now I have 4/10, and I write that as 0.4. And that's the same as 2/5. That is equivalent. Here's another question for you. What about 30/50? Remember that we only have tenths and hundredths in our place value, so we must get either a 10 or a 100 in the denominator. Is there a way to get a 10 from 50 to 10? Well, I could divide by 5. 50 divided by 5 is 10. So what's 30 divided by 5? It's 6. So I'd have 6 in my tenths, 0 in my ones. So this is the same as 0.6. However, you could do it another way. How could you go from 50 to 100 in your denominator? You could multiply by 2. So 50 times 2 is 100. So then I have to multiply 30 times 2, which is 60. And if I have 60 hundredths, I write it like this, 60 hundredths. So my decimal is 0.60. What do you notice about these two decimals here? They're equivalent, aren't they? Yeah, they're the exact same thing. Awesome. Remember that to show any fraction as a decimal, you must get tenths or hundredths in the denominator. So you have to come up with an equivalent fraction. Now, 2/4 is really tough because 4 cannot go into 10. But it can go into 100. And you might be thinking, oh, that's too hard. But just think about quarters. How much is a quarter worth? It's worth 25 cents. So 4 quarters gives you $1 or 100 cents. So 4 times 25 is 100. So then I should multiply my numerator by the same number to get an equivalent fraction. 2 times 25 is 50. So now I have 50 hundredths, and I can put that in my place value chart. 50 hundredths. There is my decimal, 0.50. That is equal to 50 hundredths. And that's how we write fractions as decimals. Now we'll quickly talk about writing decimals as fractions. So if I give you a decimal like 0.3, you know that the 3 is in the tens place value, so it's 3/10. Or if I give you one like 0.7, the 7 is in the tenths place value, so I write it as 7/10. Now what if I make it a bit tougher and I give you 35 hundredths? Well, I would write it like this, because my place values go ones, decimal, tenths, hundredths. So I have 35 hundredths, up to and including the hundredths place value, 0.35. How about 14 hundredths? I would write that as 0.14. Now here's a tricky one. What about 8 hundredths? I don't want to write that as 0.8 because this is the tenths place value. So that shows 8/10. But I have 8 hundredths that I want to show. So how I would write it is 0.08. This is the hundredths place value. This is the tenths. And since I'm dealing with hundredths, I need to include something in the hundredths place value. Let's do 2 more quick examples. So I have 60 hundredths. How would you write that as a decimal? Well, I'm dealing with hundredths, so I need to include something up to my hundredths place value. Remember that place value goes ones, decimal, tenths, hundredths. So I have 0, ones, decimal, 60. That represents 60 hundredths because I have 60 going up to and including my hundredths. And last one, let's try this one. 1/100th. 0.01. I need a 1 in my hundredths because that's what I'm dealing with, is my hundredths place value. And that's how you write decimals as fractions. One more thing that you should know is how to write equivalent decimals. We remember how to write equivalent fractions, so remember that equivalent means equal decimals. So how do we write that? Well, if I give you a decimal like 0.3, that's 3/10. 3/10 is the same as 0.30, 30 hundredths. All I did was I added on a 0 after the 3, and that makes those equivalent decimals. Here's another example. If you have 0.40, to make an equivalent decimal, you could write 0.4, because 40/100ths is the same as 4/10. Remember, I could cross out a 0 here and a 0 here and get 4/10. So those are equivalent. If you have a decimal like 0.05, to make it equivalent, you can't get rid of the 0 in front of the 5. That wouldn't work. But what you can do is tack on a 0 after the 5. So an equivalent decimal would be 0.050. That would be equivalent. Last example, if you have 0.82, an equivalent decimal would be 0.820. Tacking on a 0 at the end of the number is okay. The same way you tack on a number at the end of a decimal, you could get rid of it. 0.40 is equivalent to 0.4. You can get rid of a 0 at the end, or you could tack one on. So another equivalent decimal would be 0.400, because now I've tacked on an extra 0, and that would be okay for equivalent decimals.